Hello, welcome back to a Young Adults Bible Study. Today, we dig into Revelation chapter 12. Up until now in the book of Revelation, we've had the people being called to overcome. So the people of God have been challenged to overcome and to conquer the evils and the things that are happening around them. But it's not until here in chapter 12 that we get a really clear picture of what it is they are to overcome, of the challenge that's really facing them, of the dark activity that's happening behind the scenes. We get a picture into the spiritual realm, into the war in heaven between the dragon and God, between who we later find out is Lucifer. This section contains a number of images, and John introduces each image using the statement such as "I saw" or "behold." And we see these images introduced in a number of verses. So a new image is introduced in chapter 12, verse 1, which we're looking at today. Also in 13, verse 1, 13, verse 11, 14, verse 1, verse 6, and verse 14, as well as chapter 15, verse 1 is the final vision. And so we're going to see each of these sort of images or visions taken, and we need to make sure that we don't read them in some sort of linear or way that they're not meant to be done. There are a number of visions from various perspectives to communicate specific purposes made by John in this section. Note that this section is what John uses to separate the events of the trumpets from the bowls. Now I talked about how the trumpets and the bowls are not different events, but rather the same event from different perspectives. And if we take it from that viewpoint, then all these images in the middle are to draw our attention to what the point of judgment is. Why is judgment having to happen? What is happening behind the scenes that results in the need for judgment and the coming of God? And so the bowls and the trumpets and the seals of the scroll, and the thunders that are sealed up are more of a response to something, a response to this heavenly war, this spiritual battle, this great conflict between the dragon and God. The dragon has similarities to the Leviathan from Job chapter 40, Isaiah chapter 27, and Psalms chapter 74. The 10 horns kind of echo the beast from Daniel chapter 7, the fourth beast from Daniel chapter 7. Also notice that the dragon's color is red, which we associated with war back in chapter 6 of Revelation. And of course there's also the blasphemous heads, which we're going to see again in future parts here of Revelation, chapter 17 mostly. Finally, we'll note that he has 10 crowns on his 10 horns. So crowns represent authority or power. They represent a rulership, a kingship. Notice that crowns are a reward promised to Smyrna and Philadelphia in the letters in chapters 2 and 3. And Jesus rides into battle, into victory, with many crowns on his head. And so crowns represent an authority or a conquest or victory. All right, so what we see then is a dragon who has some kind of an authority given to him, who has some kind of power, and is looking to blaspheme or create war against God, specifically focused at God. We also notice here that in the drama that's happening in the heavenly realm, that the dragon's tail sweeps a third of the stars, and we know stars are angels from Revelation chapter 1. And so if stars are angels, then it's a third of the angels are swept out of heaven. We had a discussion about this in our young adults group, but I don't know if I have a great answer. Traditionally, I think people would say that 1/3 of the angels in heaven were swept to the earth and made to be the demons that serve Lucifer. But a question was raised in our young adults group that I thought was really solid, which was this Lucifer defeating a third of the angels? Not making them into demons, but rather just defeating them, conquering them, and a third were destroyed. That's an interesting question, and we don't know enough. I think that there's hints towards them being made into the demons, but we don't really know. And so it's kind of church tradition or whatever that we have to go with there. So here we have this imagery of a woman. The woman is about to give birth to a child, and the dragon is waiting to devour the child. Okay, so there's a couple of elements here that each have a meaning. So we have the woman who's giving birth to a child, and the desert that she flees into. And so there's a couple of images here. The woman represents the people of God, and the child represents Christ. Now we get a little glimpse of the past here where John talks about the birth pangs that are coming. And we see throughout the Old Testament and throughout history, the birth pangs of the need for the coming of Christ, the hints, the signs and symbols throughout the history of Israel that point towards the coming Messiah, the need for a Savior. Some really obvious ones are things like the Passover, or the need for sacrifices, Cain and Abel, the importance of, or the cost of sin and the importance of a rescuer from sin. And so those birth pangs are kind of the historical events that point towards the coming Messiah. And here, the coming Messiah is being born into the world. And then John kind of jumps ahead from the birth pangs and from the war in heaven that was maybe prior to creation of the earth, to a now established Jesus being born and ascending immediately into heaven, being taken up by God and protected. And so it jumps immediately to this victory through ascension, through the escape of the child, the protection of the people of God, and they escape from the dragon. And so there's an imagery here that John is not necessarily giving us a linear picture, but rather stating some major events that we need to note. The need for a Messiah and rescuer, and the success of the Messiah and rescuer. This event then is followed with the celebration in heaven, a retelling of the seventh trumpet, the theophany of the seventh trumpet. We see here that Jesus is celebrated, and there's this retelling where a mention of Lucifer being cast down, and he goes back to the earth to hunt the people of God. In Luke chapter 10, verse 18, we kind of see this already depicted, where Jesus sends out his disciples. I think he sends out 12 in that story, and they come back, and he asks them how it goes, and they say, "We saw demons cast out, and people were healed." And Jesus says, "I saw Satan fall from heaven like a bolt of lightning." And so there's something there that kind of ties into this conquest of the dragon through the birth and ascension of the child, Jesus. So after that part of the imagery, the dragon is identified as Lucifer, the ancient serpent. And of course, it links us back to Genesis chapter 3. And then he's given his twofold ability. It reveals the two tasks or two jobs that Satan is able to do. I guess they're not twofold because they're not four things. The two things that Satan is able to do, the two permissions he has. He is able to deceive the nations, and he's able to accuse people. A woe is announced at the end of chapter 12. Near the end of chapter 12 there, a woe is announced. And that woe points towards us, chapter 13, where we're going to see the beast from the sea and the beast from the earth. So we're going to see those things fulfilled in the next chapter. So the end of chapter 12 kind of summarizes with the dragon continuing to make war with the people of God. It says that he goes to make war with the rest of her children. And so it's after the people of God. And so there's a bit of a pushback there or an imagery back there that calls us back to Old Testament imagery of Israel and the hardships that they faced. But from that we get all the people of God. And so there's a sort of continued war happening throughout. We also see at the end of this chapter sort of the two contrasting descriptions of the people of God that contrast the description of what the dragon could do. So the dragon was allowed to tempt the nations and accuse the believers. The people of God are described sort of in a counter way as those who keep the commands and give a reliable testimony. So with that, we sort of head out of chapter 12 into another imagery where we're going to see the continued war between the people of God and the adversary, antagonist of God. There's this ongoing battle, and you could say that it's Satan, you could say that it's sin, you could say that he brings temptation and accusation against the people of God. So the people of God are standing firm on the testimony and commandments of God in order to resist and overcome the work of the devil. And we'll see that happening and playing out in the chapters 13 and 14. Thanks for tuning in this week. Sorry for the late upload. I've just been a bit busy recently with running the church while senior pastor's on sabbatical. But we're going to keep things moving, and I will have the rest of the chapters caught up shortly. See you guys next time for chapter 13.